All right, sorry about that. Just trying to find my next video. Okay, so that was a little sampler of the Kung living in the Kalahari. And if you ever saw that movie, The Gods Must Be Crazy, about this hunter-gatherer guy that finds a Coke bottle that someone's tossed out of an airplane, and it introduced this whole new piece of technology into their tribe. And everyone wanted the Coke bottle because you could use it for everything from pounding seeds to rolling out your your meal to a musical instrument blowing on it. You could look through it. And all of a sudden, in this hunter-gatherer society where everyone kind of had the same clothes, the same food, the same tools, the same resources, this thing from the outside came in and completely over upset the balance in the culture. And so in this movie, one of the young men was tasked with taking it back to the gods from whence it came, because it was just causing problems in the village. And it follows this young Kalahari bushman as he ventures and encounters people who have more what we would be familiar with 21st century technology, like Jeeps and winches and guns and all these sorts of things. So if you haven't ever seen that movie, I'd recommend it. It's a good one. It's called The Gods Must Be Crazy. And in chapter 6 of our book, and some of your editions, it will be chapter 7, they're talking about adaptation to the environment. And we already talked about earlier, we could look at these people as being very primitive, right? They're using sticks. I mean, they're running around in loincloths. They don't even have any shoes. They don't have Bic lighters, but look at the technology these people have to survive. I mean, how many of you could survive more than a couple days in that desert environment the Kalahari were living in? How many of you could make a fire from 2 twigs rubbed together? I mean, that's some incredible technology. How many of you would be able to track an animal and know how to get it out of its burrow? I mean, how many of you would know how to dress out a badger for badger barbecue in the afternoon? I'm assuming that was a badger they pulled out of that hole. And if you know anything about badgers, holy cow, you don't go into a badger's hole after a badger, but that was like lunchtime. And but because they are a foraging semi-nomadic society, they're also very egalitarian, very cooperative. You could see the incredible level of cooperation going amongst the hunters. While one is jamming a stick in one hole, the others are looking at the other entrances or exits to make sure whatever they're hunting isn't fleeing. Um, Anyways, let's go through real quick, and then I'm going to show you another clip. So adaptation, the one we're focusing right now, is called foraging. And adaptation is the process of development by organisms to survive and reproduce in an environment. So humans, just like every other species, we found ways to adapt our behavior and to come up with tools and techniques in order to survive, whether it's in the Kalahari Desert or the Amazonian rainforest or the Arctic. Humans have filled all of these environmental zones, but they have adapted their clothing, their tool use, their technology, so that they can survive in these environments. The production aspect is the exploitation of raw materials. So whether that's pulling a branch off a tree and turning it into a digging tool, or using 2 twigs to make fire, that is the production, using raw materials and turning them into something useful. And there's also an organization that comes with adaptation. And this we find in these foraging type cultures. The first way these cultures are organized is there's a division of labor. In other words, different people of these groups or different members of the group have different responsibilities. So we have gender distinctions. Men traditionally in these hunter-gatherer types of societies have been the hunters. In fact, in some cultures, it was actually taboo for women to hunt animals, having to do with offending the animal spirits or inuas or what have you. There's also divisions of labor based on age. For example, people in their prime are going to have different expectations, rules, and duties than young people or old people. And then obviously your skill set. Perhaps your skill set is birthing babies, or you know where all the good berries are, or maybe you're a really good tracker. Those skill sets are going to determine your role or function within the tribe, band, or group. Okay, next is patterns of cooperation. And this is how people work together to accomplish a task. And so we just saw how those men were working as a team to hunt that animal. One guy's trying to smoke or subdue the badger with smoke in its hole. Others are bringing him wood. Others are checking the other exits. This is very helpful if you're hunting large game, because there's no way one of these Kalahari Bushmen is going to bring back a full roebuck or a water buffalo or something that's weighing thousands of pounds, right? But if you're hunting with a band, you can quarter out, section out the large game, and you bring it back to the village. So foragers get their food from gathering wild plants and hunting animals. They're not involved in domestication of plants or animals. They are just basically wandering around their environment looking for edibles, whether that's growing on trees, whether it's digging up roots, or whether it's hunting the wildlife that lives there. And within foragers, here are 6 traits, and this is where people have collected field work or data on hunter-gatherer tribes around the world in different places and times, and then they've tried to come up with universal themes or things that they see in these people groups. So firstly, there's seasonal mobility. In other words, you have to move with the weather. So in the summer, you may be able to hunt and forage up in the high mountains, but as fall and winter comes, you're going to want to move down into the valleys. Same thing, if you're in an area for very long, the game is either going to be hunted out or it's going to run away from you, and you're going to have eaten all the fruit and berries. And so after a period of days or weeks, your band or group is going to have to move to the next valley over or some place where you haven't used all the resources. Secondly, we find division of labor. And like we mentioned earlier, that can be based on gender, age, or skill set. Hunter-gatherer groups tend to go through cycles of congregation, because think about it, if you're trying to just live off the land, you're not going to want to have more than one or a couple families living together as a group. It just creates too much pressure on the water supply, the fuel supply, the food supply. So you generally are living most of the year in very small family groups, or maybe multi-generational family groups, and that will be your like band. But you're also part of a larger ethnic group, a larger tribal group, where you will have certain set times and places where you will congregate and meet. And this is often where people will catch up on the news, barter and exchange goods, also finding spouses and mates from other families, other bands when you come together and meet. But they can only stay together for a short period of time, and then they have to disperse again. One of the most famous gatherings of tribal hunter-gatherer groups was at the Little Bighorn in American history. And this is where we had, I believe, 2 bands of the Cheyenne, and the different groups of the Sioux all came together, and there were literally thousands of Indians in this encampment together. Now, normally they would have been in much smaller bands, in the 10s to the 100s at the most, but in this particular time and place, you had a congregation of all the tribes of the Sioux and their cousin tribes, the Cheyenne. And that is the gathering that Custer rode into. He thought he was riding into one of these little groups, like he had been quite successful subduing in the past, but this time he was seeing the entire Sioux Nation. The next is bands. I already talked about that. That's like the small family group. 5 is reciprocal sharing. In these cultures, because you're nomadic, there's no point to hoard things. You simply have the tools, the clothing, and the shelter you need to survive. You don't want to carry extra because you know you're going to have to pack up and move it within a couple weeks. And basically all your neighbors have the same sorts of things you have. So it's a very egalitarian society. If you had a good berry picking day, you may want to share some of those berries with some of the other people in the tribe because you're not going to be able to eat them all. You don't want them to go bad. You don't want to collect rodents. But see, this isn't like in a village or a settled society where you have storehouses or granaries or things where you can save stuff for the winter. Everything is pretty much eaten as is. So you're going through periods of feasting and then famine. And so the idea here is, when you have been blessed with a lot of berries or fish or meat or whatever it happens to be, you want to share that with other members of the band. And then hopefully, if you have a hard time or you get injured or you have a poor day hunting, someone else who was successful will share with you. And this is also like a social welfare program of where widows or the old or sick or people who do not have a provider are shared with by those who are able to hunt and forage in the band. Okay. And then finally, even in these nomadic tribal societies that don't live in a set place, there is still a sense of, I don't want to use the word ownership, but rights and privileges to certain resources. That might be a valley, it might be the fish in a river, it might be the acorns or the pine nuts that grow on certain trees. And they have established like hereditary or ancestral rights to certain hunting or harvesting grounds. And when those are violated, it can cause conflict between different bands or different tribal groups. All right. We saw that quick video on the Kung, and let me just tell you a little bit more about them. The Kung average 17 hours per week foraging. For women, it typically works out to about 13 hours a week, and for men, 22 hours a week. How many hours a week do you think the typical American works? We talk about like a 40-hour work week, but that's just your formal job. That's not counting all the work you do at home, all the side projects you have going. Most Americans are working 60 plus, if not 80 hours a week. Imagine if you only had to work 20 hours a week to provide for the needs of your family. How much free time that would give you to simply be with the people you love, to enjoy your hobbies, or just reposing, just hanging out and enjoying life. And so even though it may look hard, I mean, the hardest thing about this is there's no guarantees, right? Every day you have to catch the food for that day or harvest the food for that day. Now, some groups have been able to preserve food through like drying it, through like making jerky. In the Americas, the Indians were famous for making pemmican, where they would take dried meat and dried berries and nuts, and they would mush it, grind it all together, and they would make, it was like great travel food. In fact, I still use that when I hike today because it's lightweight, because it's dried, but it's full of protein and nutrition, vitamins, minerals from the fruits and vegetables. And so that would help them get through the hard or the lean times. But for the most part, they were living, guess what? You don't get to be a man. You're considered like a boy your whole life in that tribe. And I don't know, I would love to talk more about initiation rituals and that transition, but let me just make this quick comment, because we see these in cultures throughout the world where there's a very pronounced shift from childhood to adulthood, and it's usually through some sort of trauma or experience or quest that transitions you from childhood to adulthood. And be thinking about it. Do we have anything like that in American culture in the early part of the 21st century? Or are we just in this like prolonged adolescent, almost like dusk, right? It's not really childhood and it's not really adulthood, but we're in this weird kind of limbo adolescence that for some people can last 10, maybe 20 years. And that's really shocking. In these cultures where you have a clear set definition, you are prepared for that your whole life. You see that as this ultimate moment where you're going to leave the past behind and then enter into adulthood. And I think not having that in our culture is kind of a detriment in a way, because it leaves our young people in limbo. So talk to me a little bit as a class. What would be the closest things you could think of in American culture when you feel like you'll be treated like an adult man or woman? And a lot of you are in your late teens or early 20s right now. Do you feel like an adult men or women? Or do you feel like you're still being treated like a child? Or sometimes people expect you to act like an adult, but then they give you the privileges of a child. And that's frustrating too, right? If you want me to act like an adult, treat me like an adult. If you want to treat me like a child, then let me have the freedom of a child and not the responsibilities of an adult. So anyone have any thoughts on when you get considered an adult in American society? Now, I understand legally at 18, you're considered an adult, and in courts of law and things in our culture, but there's no ritual, there's no transition. It's just a passing of the years. So what I'm looking at, is there some sort of event or thing you can do in your life where people will see you as an adult?
I was thinking like moving out of your parents' house, and or getting married. Either of
Yeah,
those.
that's so weird. So many people are not treated as adults in our culture until they actually marry. And then for the first time, the day before they got married, they're a child, and the day after, they're considered an adult. But you're right, Kendall. That's how, when my dad started to treat me like an adult, was when I moved out and started to support myself. And after I had done that for a couple years, I noticed our relationship changed. He stopped trying to micromanage me and tell me to do all these, but he was more just like, he was still supportive, but now it was supportive as me as an independent householder, an independent man. Even though I was still young, I wasn't dependent upon him for my survival anymore. How about for women? I know for some people, men and women, when they went off to join the military, um, and I know the military, a lot of people talk about how that grew them up, how it made a man or woman out of them. And because think of the responsibilities, think of the rigor, think of the expectations put upon you. So that's another way I've noticed people in our culture achieve adulthood, is through military service or service of some other kind. Talk to me, the women, because since I'm not a woman, I don't know.
I was gonna say, I mean, I think for women, it's maybe when they move out on their own and no longer, like, I see it as like when a daughter no longer goes to her father for problems, that she can either do.
Right, thanks, Kaylee. I mean, I can
Hey,
see. Oh, go ahead.
It's so Kaylee, but I'm on Autumn's thing. My thing keeps logging me out. But basically just like when either a girl does stuff on her own, or B, moves out.
Yes, yes. And I think the biological of the woman having her first menstrual cycle, that's also huge, just because of the implications of it. I think it has a lot more significance than like the first time a man is able to ejaculate or has a nocturnal emission or something like that. There seems to be something profoundly associated with womanhood and the ability to bear children. And a lot of cultures make a really, really big deal out of that.
I wouldn't say that like it would be when a woman first has her first menstrual cycle is when she's considered a woman, because that can happen at the age of 9, and obviously you're not a woman when you're 9. so
in
wild.
in these tribal cultures you are.
Yeah, but in our society, if that
No,
were to happen,
you're not. Right. So you're right. In our culture, that's probably not enough to get you full womanhood status, even though you've definitely had a profound change taking place, I'm sure biologically and emotionally. Anyone else want to talk into that?
Yeah, I would say also going to college is a big thing. I know that was
Sure.
kind of where my mind shifted, and you know, the way my parents treated me shifted as well. As well as I do think having like your own car, you know, having a license and then having your own mobility is just like a really natural kind of free and adulthood.
Do you see how it's so interesting, just kind of stepping back and listening not only to my examples, but some of the classmates' examples? Almost all these American adulthood examples have to do with achieving a certain level of independence. And in a tribal culture, that's not even part of the mindset, because you're so interconnected with the other people of the tribe and the group. And so this is what I'm telling you about this class. What's so great, as we look at other cultures, if you allow yourself to use them as a mirror to look back at yourself, you can get really great insights about the way we've been brought up, the way we think, that we don't even think about because it's just such a natural part of being brought up as an American. And anyways, good participation. I really appreciated that.
Ooh, also one more is like in our society, whenever you turn 21, it's like you're kind of seeing this.
When you turn legal.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, or 25 when you can legally rent a car.
Yeah, it's so weird, right? We have these different stages. And once again, those are largely have to do with either law or liability and responsibility, because we have associated, and we've even used the scientific method, right? Insurance companies crunch data to determine rates, and they have determined under a certain age, especially for males, they don't want to rent you a car. It's just the chances of something bad happening are too great. It's not worth the money they would have made in renting 25 and under males' cars. And even insurance rates, I believe, are different for men and women. That's one place in our society where women, I think, have an advantage based on gender, as opposed to males. And once again, it's using data to try to predict behaviors, and that's part of how our society rolls. And so it's economic, it has to do with liability and risk-taking. All right, the second part of the chapter switches from the hunter-gatherers to domestication. And in domestication, it's the intentional planting of crops and taming of animals. So now we're not just wandering around picking whatever's growing or hunting whatever comes across our path, but we're being intentional about it. We're making the connection between different plants and the seeds they bear, and that if we save some of those seeds or put some of those plants or water them, there'll be plants there when we come through next year. So this is kind of like in between hunter-gatherer and like full-scale domestication. This is kind of like domestication light. So you might domesticate a dog as a hunter-gatherer, and you might incorporate the dog into your band or group, and the dog may actually help you hunt, right? Or it might carry your sled or your supplies, or you might use it to be a warning against intruders or invaders. And so we're not just talking about domestication of things to eat, like cattle or chicken or pigs, but it could also be domestication of the horse or the camel or a dog, things that we use as beasts of burden, or we might milk, or we might actually have as like a pet or companion, right? So just something we like to have around. But the same thing is occurring with animals. And I gave the example earlier about corn. and how there is no wild corn today. It has been so changed by human beings over the millennia that we took what was basically a grass with grass seeds, and through selective breeding, humans were able to produce like foot-long ears of delicious corn that we have today. And this same thing has been done with almost all the plants that humans use for food. There are still wild bananas, and if you see them, they look very different from domesticated bananas. Domesticated bananas have been selected to be the perfect size and shape for the human hand. But a wild banana is short, fat, squat, and full of seeds. But through the years of selective breeding, we have chosen. Same thing with apples, pears, peaches, nectarine. All these different plants are not like they were created at the beginning, but they have been interacted with and selected for different traits, sweetness, size, texture, color, by humans. And now we've got to a place where we can actually do this without hybridization, and we can actually go in and splice certain traits we desire into different plants and animals. So in your lifetime, you are going to see things and experience things that the world has never seen before, simply because our level of technology and the way we can engage with the natural world, plants and animals. And in fact, there's quite a bit of controversy in our country over this, and I don't quite understand it fully, but at the moment, companies do not have to label genetically modified food. That would be GMO food. Now, many companies will label this is a non-GMO food, and they'll use it as like a marketing technique. But if it doesn't have a this is not a GMO label, you can't assume that that broccoli you're eating is just broccoli. It may have been crossed with cauliflower. And if you're allergic to cauliflower, you could have a breakout by eating what looks like broccoli to you. They have even put human genes into pigs to produce a more lean and tender pork product. And I don't know what you feel about things like that. In Europe, they call it frankenfood. And it's why there's a lot of ban against certain American meats and produce, because in Germany, they're a little bit ahead of us on the progressive curve, and they want to know where the food came from and what's in it. And if you've crossed plants or animals genetically to produce a certain product, they want it on the label, and they want the choice to know about it. To me personally, I think that's completely reasonable. I mean, I don't know about banning it because we haven't done enough research. It may be perfectly healthy and fine. We don't know yet because this is really new technology. We haven't been able to do like decades-long studies to see what happens if you're eating genetically modified food. Is that going to genetically modify the person eating it? And that science is still coming in. But I think labeling it would be a good thing, personally. Okay, onward. So cultivation, this is the intentional selection and caring for certain species of plants that are beneficial to humans. And so these don't just have to be food plants. It could be like tobacco. It could be like indigo for making dye, but it's any sort of interaction where humans are specifically selecting and raising plants for the benefit they bring to us as a species. And in cultivation, the first part we mentioned was horticulture. And horticulture is like the most basic level. It's where you might go in and clear a forest, burn the trees and the underbrush, and then plant in that cleared space. But then when you deplete the soil, you move on, clear some more forest, plant until you use up that resources, and then you keep moving. So it's very labor intensive and it's not long term. Horticulture is often described by the use of hand tools, intense cultivation for 1 or 2 years, and and then leaving the land fallow, where you just kind of leave the land. Now, you may be able to come back to it after a couple of years when it's had a chance to rest and rejuvenate, but you can only, and I don't know if you've ever gardened or anything at home, but if your property has never had stuff grow on it before, usually that first year, you just have a great crop because it has all those resources and stuff. But if you keep planting the same plants in the same place year after year, you'll notice you have a diminishment of returns. And we even see this, I'm writing this thing in my book for environmental ethics right now. And that's part of what I'm mentioning in the book, that God in his care for the creation even gives plants and animals a Sabbath. Even the land gets a Sabbath in the Mosaic Law. So animals, especially draft animals like a horse or a donkey or a mule, gets a Sabbath one day a week, just like humans. They don't have to work, and just as you're not supposed to work, they get a day of rest. Trees and vineyards, they would get a rest once every 7 years, where you weren't to prune them, but you were simply to let them grow as they wanted. And you weren't to harvest them. If they produced fruit that year, that was for the wild animals, the undomesticated animals, for widows and the poor, and for strangers in the land. So it was part of kind of God's social welfare and protection. And even the fields, the earth itself got a rest once every 7 years, where you weren't to till it. You were simply to let the land go fallow and rest. And I just think that's really, really interesting that in the scriptures, we even have rest given to these domesticated plants and animals. We can't just work them nonstop. All right, the next stage is called intensive agriculture. And intensive agriculture, we have one or more crops are being produced each year. So you might start with one type of crop in the spring, and then you have another crop in the fall. Or you might even live in a region where you can grow winter crops if it's temperate enough climate. We have animal-powered plows, irrigation of fields, and fertilizer. And so now it's not just hand tools, but you're actually really getting in and turning up the soil, and you're using beast of burden, even tools like plows to do this. You've also understood that if you bring in water and fertilize and irrigate, you're going to have a much greater return on your crops. And in those cases, you can use the same land year after year after year after year, as long as you're putting fertilizers and nutrients back into the soil. And so you get into composting and all this stuff. And then finally, where we are in the United States, in fact, we may even be on this now, but this would be called mechanized agriculture. And this is where machines, artificial fertilizers, pesticides, genetically altered crops are being planted in America. And I don't know if it's still on Netflix, if you haven't banned Netflix yet, but there was a show called Food and Corp, and it talked about food growing in America, and it's really quite horrifying. It should have been labeled as like a horror documentary. I believe 80% of the seeds that we grow our crops with in this country are controlled by 5 companies. So wrap your head around that for a minute. 5 corporations own 80% of the seed stock in this country. And I normally don't like to drop names, but let's throw Monsanto under the bus for a minute. Monsanto not only is one of these 5 companies, but their seeds come coated. I'm not sure if it's a pesticide or herbicide to kill weeds or insects, but in order to get the seeds to generate, you have to use Monsanto's fertilizer or pesticide sprays, which actually activates the seed to grow. And so not only do they get you to buy their seeds, but then you have to buy their fertilizers to activate the seeds. And when those plants grow, at the genetic level, there are markers showing that this is a product of Monsanto, that they have genetically engineered this corn, these soybeans. Those are the two biggies, the two big GMOs in the country, but there's most of our mass produced produce has been genetically modified to some degree. And say you have a field next door to a Monsanto field. Well, if they come in and they take a sample of your corns or of your soybeans, if it has cross-pollinated with the Monsanto field, it is going to have the genetic markers of their corn in your field on your corn. And they have successfully sued farmers for having their seed in their fields, even though they did not plant Monsanto seed. And their lawyers have been very successful, not just in the United States, but around the world, bringing claims, litigation against these small farmers who inadvertently have had their crops being cross-pollinated by these genetically modified foods. Anyone have any thoughts or comments on that? Now, the upside, of course, is we're able to produce incredible amounts of food with very little human labor, right? Because we have these huge machines and thrashers and harvesters. And what a mechanized farmer could do might have taken thousands of people to have done by hand in the past. And so what's happened in the American farm industry, instead of having all these small family farms throughout the country, more and more of these small farms have had to sell to these big corporations who then run these mechanized farms. And these small family farmers who maybe have done this generationally either have to work for the big companies or they need to find some other way to make a living, because there's no way a small person can compete with these corporate farming interests.
I think
the benefit is tons of food. The bad side is a lot of these small farmers are being put out of business. Go ahead, David.
I think that's a really bad trait that we are going into. I remember hearing about the Monsanto company and how they basically are destroying lives. And along with the Monsanto, so I used to live in Alabama, and there's a lake that I used to live by. And for the longest time, I was always told that, you can't eat the fish out of that lake because it's poisonous. Well, it has like a lot of, so like the Monsanto's company actually legally like dumped a lot of poisonous materials into the lake, and you can't eat the fish anymore. So
Right.
I personally hate Monsanto, and I think that they should not be in business anymore. Yeah.
Good. Thanks, David. Any other thoughts, comments? And I don't just want to be kind of like this rabid environmental activist here, but food's important, and I think we need to be aware. Now, I think some of the positives that have come out of this corporate growing of food is in Europe and the United States, we're seeing kind of a reaction against that, where we do have a lot more people actually going back and trying to do small farms, but they're doing them in kind of like little niches, like organic produce, right? We vow not to use pesticides on our crops or herbicides on our crops, and you can get certified that. But even there, you have to do your research and be careful, right? Because anyone can put a sticker on their produce, but has it been verified? Has it been shown that they are following certain practices? Some people are producing milk that is just from their small home type dairies. They maybe only have a dozen or 20 cows instead of these other massive milk producers where they have thousands of cows, right? And they're using all sorts of hormones and antibiotics and things. And once again, they're doing it to try to have a safe, healthy product. But think how far the milk you get at Vaughn's or Ralph's is from the cow as opposed to having your own cow in the yard or in your neighbor's yard and you're buying and drinking raw milk. Now, can you get sick from raw milk? Yeah, you can. But there's also problems that can happen with drinking highly pasteurized milk over time. So once again, wisdom, I don't want to just act like this is a black and white and all big corporations are evil and all little home gardeners are good, but I want you to be aware of how food is done in this country on a large scale and some of the potential problems having something so necessary for human thriving and well-being in the hands of a few. And that's all I want to make you aware of at this time. Okay, let me try to finish this section on domestication. So agrarian cultures mark the beginning of civilization, at least according to history and anthropology. That's where civilization begins once people live in settled villages or cities and they're able to produce enough food because of their agrarian advancements that now people can specialize in labor. Some people can now be educators, some people can be doctors, other people can be security or military, other people can be priests, other people can rule or be the bureaucracy. And so this is where we get the beginning of written language, and that is where society, at least our book and history says, that's when civilization begins. And so if we look around the world, it is kind of uncanny. We find most of these ancient river valley agrarian cultures begin to have written records about 3,500 BCE. Anyone know when the biblical flood was supposed to be? Roughly somewhere around 4,000 BCE, more or less, if you're taking a literal historical biblical chronology, which, I mean, that's really interesting. So give or take 500 years, it's basically putting civilization beginning with the societies right after the biblical flood. But that's a biblical perspective. Our book is definitely going from proto-humans, evolving into humans, into going from hunter-gatherers, into going to horticulture, pastoralism, agrarian societies. And so that's how the book is seeing it. We're going from simple to complex, and with the development of cities, we have civilization beginning. Who created the first city in the Bible? Anyone remember? Very good. It was, wasn't it Cain? Was it Cain, or was it I think Cain founded the first city, which is the second generation right after Adam and Eve. If it's not Cain, I see Rhea's looking it up for me, so thanks, Rhea. I'm going to keep going and you jump in once you get the answer. All right, so agrarian cultures, the living in city where specialized labor could be performed. These included professional priestly caste, scribes with writing, tool makers, craftsmen, artists, professional military bureaucracy, etc. At the same time that we've gone from horticulture to more intensive agriculture to mechanized agriculture, like in our society, these whole societies were being developed over pastoralism, where they wouldn't settle in one place, but these were like herds people, where they would raise sheep or goats or horses or camels, and they would travel with their herds. And I just find this incredibly fascinating when you think about the difference between like a sedentary agrarian culture and a nomadic herd culture. And think of the different technology they're going to need, the different skill sets they're going to have to survive. But a lot of these nomadic and agrarian cultures were able to work out sort of like a symbiotic relationship, because the herd cultures were migratory. They would come and go in different regions where the agrarian people are sedentary. Because they're sedentary, they can do things like manufacture goods, do metallurgy, have kilns, make pottery, have looms, things that a nomadic group is probably not going to be able to carry on their journeys. But the nomadic people are going to have things like meat and milk and cheese and leather and fur and wool, and they can barter and trade these things with these domestic agrarian people for items that the nomadic people can't produce. And so in this sense, they could get along. And there's actually a quite famous example of this in the country of Rwanda, where you had the Tutsis and the Hutsu, the Tutsis and the Hutsis. And when the French came into Rwanda and colonized it, they assumed that the Tutsis were more noble. And I hope I'm not butchering these names. I apologize if you're from Rwanda, and I am. But the Tutsis, they looked more European. Even though they were African people, they were dark in complexion, they had higher cheekbones, thinner noses and lips, taller and more slender. And so the French overlords put the Tutsis, these nomadic people, in charge, even though they were only like 10% of the population, which caused a lot of resentment among the more agrarian Hutsis, who had these nomadic groups put in leaderships of bureaucracy, government, etc. And so when the French finally left and gave the country back to the Rwandans, first of all, the French and the British, the Spanish, the Portuguese, Germans made artificial lines. Like, there is no country of Rwanda, but you had these agrarian people groups living in a Central African region, and you had this nomadic group moving in and out of that region. But the Europeans came in and basically divvied up this country, and now all of a sudden, maybe the Tutsis' nomadic wanderings would take them through 3 or 4 different countries. It's not like they're just staying within Rwanda. The agrarian people are settled, right? But what if there was a band of that tribe in the neighboring country? They're now cut off and seen as a different people group because they're no longer in the artificial constructs. Anyways, long story short, when the French left, there was a revolt among the Hutsis against the Tutsis. And in fact, it was trying to be almost like a full-scale genocide where the Hutsis were going in and slaughtering the Tutsis. The Tutsis were able to flee into neighboring countries. They were able to reorganize, militarize, and were able to come back in and take back over the country. And part of this happened because of this imposition that was brought from the outside, where you took 2 people groups who had been living in a symbiotic relationship, and now that they were put in this artificial constraints and hierarchies, it caused a lot of resentment later on in that country's history. I'm not quite sure how Rwanda's doing now, but I hope they have found some way to live in peace. Rhea, did you find the first city person?
From what I can see, unless I'm missing something, it doesn't look like it actually really mentions cities until after the flood, and then it was talking about
No, we definitely have cities before the flood.
Yeah.
I'll look at it later, but I'm pretty sure it's Cain, but I can double check.
Yeah.
So the biblical account, once again, it has man starting very high, and then there's kind of like a breakdown in humanity. And in our textbook, coming from more of a secular humanist with applied evolution, it's starting very simple, even proto-humans developing to where we are today. So it's just so interesting to see those 2 different perspectives dealing with anthropology. All right, well, I think we're out of time, but I think that covered that section well enough. For next week, I already told you I'm traveling, so make sure you do your midterm by Tuesday if you haven't done it by then. If you're finished, just take the day off, or you can be thinking about the book report or the cultural fair. And I want us to do the chapter on marriage next time, which I believe is chapter 8. And I think you will find that quite fascinating. Yeah, at least in my version, it's chapter 8, marriage and family. We'll be doing a week from today.
Oh, so you were correct. It is Cain. I missed it. It
Oh,
was
good.
weird that I was looking. So yes,
I haven't
Cain.
completely lost my memory. So we have, and he was also our first agrarian, or at least horticulture person. And Abel was the first pastoralist, at least from the biblical record. So the Bible has these things not taking place over hundreds of thousands of years, but happening right out the chute. All right. Have a good afternoon, you guys.
Thank you.